at least the title of our lesson this morning is Honor Life. And as we study this, the point of this lesson, we will see is to respect human life as God does. And our passages of Scripture are Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, and then two passages in 1 Samuel regarding one of David's experiences. So, a fellow by the name of Tony Evans, and I have no idea who he is or was, he says, it's almost universally accepted that killing others is wrong, but life and the value of life have never been more discussed and debated than they have in recent years. And so with that as a backdrop of what we're going to be studying, even as you know, if you watched yesterday the President's announcement of his nomination for the person to take the role of Supreme Court Justice, or you followed any of the news broadcasts of pro or against his nominee, or you stayed up with the abortion issue, you know that this commandment should have an influence on all of those decisions. So let's look first at Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. You can probably read it. But for life connection, most people acknowledge the value of human life, but we don't all agree on what that means or who it includes. Our culture is divided over the value of unborn children, the elderly, and those who can't support or care for themselves. Others deem some lives are not valuable, which is reflected in racism, discrimination, and murder. God values all human life. He makes no exceptions. And we are to value life as he does. So what are some ways our society devalues human life?
Well, when somebody goes out and shoots somebody.
Okay? Just random murder. Yeah.
Abortion.
There's an article in the paper today of something that happened 3 or 4 years ago. Someone was running at Duncan, just his morning run, and these 3 teenagers came by and just shot him.
And shot him, right? Yeah. Barbara?
Abortion.
Yeah, abortion, okay. It's another way. Someone else? Ways in which our society devalues human life.
Drug dealers.
Yes, truly. Drug dealing is also a devaluation of human life. Well, as that fellow Tony Evans said, it has been very discussed and debated in these days. And that debate is current, daily, moment by moment almost. So, the setting of this, of course, is at Mount Sinai. The people of Israel listened to the Lord's words, the 10 Commandments, which emphasized how they were to live in relation to God and to other people. The 6th commandment called for them to respect human life. Several hundred years later, David, whom God had chosen as the next king of Israel, obeyed this command even though King Saul, the first ruler of Israel, sought to kill him. So Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Do not murder. In the Hebrew, these are just 2 words. The first word is lo, which means no or not. And the second word is a particular word, murder. This word is used something like 46 times in the Old Testament, but it is a particular word. There are other words to kill and to harm people, but the word for murder is R-A-T-Z-A-C-H, spelled out in our English language, ratzah, and it means It occurs 47 times in the Old Testament. It has a very specific range of meaning. The term can be defined as referring to unauthorized taking of human life for personal reasons. In the Old Testament, this term was used to refer to a person who slew another accidentally and then fled to a city of refuge. Excuse me. You remember the cities of refuge that are delineated and talked about in the book of Numbers and also Joshua? Cities of refuge were a place where if a person inadvertently killed someone, did something that killed another person, but they had not meant to kill the person, but they did, then the guilty one could flee to a city of refuge, and in that city of refuge, it was illegal for anyone to go and take revenge on that person. He had to live there until the high priest died. And if the high priest was young, that could mean a long time. Once the high priest was passed away, the current living high priest, then that person could return back to his former place of where he lived. But the city of refuge was a place where a guilty person who had inadvertently, accidentally, without intention, had killed another person, then he could flee to one of these cities of refuge. And I'm not real sure, but I think there was something like 8 or 10 different cities of refuge that were set up across Israel so that people could flee to those areas as a place where they could. And it said if they went outside of the city walls, they were, again, the revenger could come and exact some penalty upon them. As long as they were within the city walls, they were protected by the ordinance sent down called the city of refuge. But apart from that one exception, the term is used in Scripture exclusively in reference to malicious, intentional action to kill an innocent person, or what we would call premeditated murder. So this commandment says, do not murder. Do not intentionally, with premeditation, kill another person. That's murder according to the Old Testament statement. And so the crime of murder relates in part to human beings being made in the image of God. Speaking to Noah after the flood, God commanded, whoever sheds human blood, by humans his blood will be shed. For God made humans in his image. And we see that in Genesis chapter 2, where it says God made man and woman. He made them in his image. We are all made in God's image. And so God said that we should respect one another because each of us were made in God's image. No exceptions to that, in fact, as far as murder is concerned. And also in the New Testament, just as some explanation, because there's a lot of killing that takes place in this world, right? There are armies, there are wars, and people are killed. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul noted that governments are established by God and authorized by him to, quote, use the sword. We know that David and other kings had many wars, that God had actually commanded the children of Israel to chase out the different peoples that lived in the Holy Land that God had given to the children of Israel. So this command, no murder, no intentional premeditated killing of an innocent person, does not apply to wars. It does not apply to killing that takes place in wars. And I know, not by experience, but just by knowing others, know that in wars, when men or women have to use their guns to kill an enemy, it sometimes brings great psychological trauma to them throughout their lifetime. But this command does not relate to that. It is not good, and none of us like to see anyone killed. But this command, do not murder, does not relate or does not bar wars or killing of the enemy when the government has sent an army of troops out to fight. Neither does this bar capital punishment. Some have quoted this as a statement barring capital punishment. Capital punishment is actually approved in the Old Testament and essentially commanded. If somebody kills another person, that then they can be brought to justice and put to death. And so the scripture actually says there are certain kinds of commands broken or acts committed that do deserve the death penalty. God commands in Exodus chapter 21:12, put to death those who have committed murder. Also, in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, commands that people who commit adultery could be killed. Those who practiced idolatry in Exodus chapter 22:20 can be put to death. And those who do human sacrifice can also be put to death, as given in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 5. Now, these commands are a part of the Mosaic law. They are not a part of the Ten Commandments. And so the Old Testament is very clear on penalties that require death. The New Testament has softened that, it appears, somewhat. But in certain instances, killing another person in war was allowable. Deuteronomy 13, verse 15, and also 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. So, this do not murder command is a very specific command for someone who is planning on and intentionally kills another person, an innocent person who has done no wrong or who is just there. And so your comment, or Betty's comment, I don't remember which, about just the random killing of people will fit that definition. It is an intentional act to kill an innocent person. Comments here? No comments? Yes, sir.
Bill, we didn't mention a while ago, but evidently it's more prevalent than we're aware of in this part of the country, but that's human trafficking.
Human trafficking would fit here, and when we broaden this to mean honor God's creation. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are many facets of sin or degradation in our society and in the world that does not honor God's creation.
Bill?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes in combat, you kill somebody, you don't really know they're shooting at you, and you have to protect yourself.
That's true. And that is not outlawed by this command. This do not murder does not relate to armies fighting against one another or killing somebody that's trying to kill you. Other thoughts, questions?
What about self-defense?
Self-defense is okay. If somebody's trying to kill you, then you're not intentionally trying to kill an innocent person. You are defending yourself. Other questions? Question here?
Tell them your opinion.
That was wrong.
We had this discussion this morning.
Okay.
I was just saying to Betty this morning that, I would probably have a hard time with this if somebody was to harm any of my grandkids or something like that. That, I would retaliate, and, that's probably not the right way to look at it, but I don't think I could live with myself if I didn't do it, so,
And I told him he couldn't do that.
she told me I couldn't do that, but I told her it would happen. And,
Hold him tight, Eddie. Well, remember, there's also the law in here that's given, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Actually, that was an important principle that was set down in the Jewish law. Because to that time, if somebody broke an arm or broke out a leg or broke out a tooth or whatever, they could just go kill a person. But this limits it. It says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If they put out your eye, you can put out their eye. If they knock out a tooth or teeth, you can knock out their teeth. But you can't go beyond the damage that you have faced in retaliating against them on that matter. And so that looks to us in this day probably as being really severe. But actually it was less severe than what in that society they had been experiencing.
You can go beat them up real good.
Just can't kill him.
Yeah.
Now, adding to this, we need to remember that Jesus also spoke on this. Would someone turn to Matthew chapter 5 and read for us verse 21 and 22? Matthew 5, verses 21 and 22.
Under the laws of Moses, the rule was, if you murder, you must die. But I have added to that rule and tell you that if you are only angry, even in your own home, you are in danger of judgment. If you call your friend an idiot, you are in danger of being brought out before the court. And if you curse him, you are in danger of the fires of hell.
So here Jesus broadens this and says, this is not just the act of actually throwing a spear, shooting an arrow, or shooting a gun and killing a person. You have to look at the intention. If you are hating someone, you are breaking this commandment. If you are doing malicious slander of someone, you are actually breaking this commandment. You are dishonoring God's creation. And so later on we see this, you shall not lie, you shall not have jealousy, and so on, which delineates some of this even further. But a malicious attempt to destroy a person's character based on who he is, or what his ethnicity is, or what he is in relation to you, for instance, in competition, that is wrong, and it stems off of this commandment: do not commit murder. Questions on that? Thus, based on what Jesus has said, we can also violate this commandment when we show disregard for human life through racism, discrimination, defamation, or other hateful attitudes and actions. And so each of us need to face the question, are we living with bitterness in our life? What caused you to become bitter toward a person or a group? Is God leading you to forgive someone who hurt you? Or do you need to be forgiven because of your hatred or disgust or not accepting others? It's a good question that we need to ask ourselves. So out of this truth, these two words in this commandment, God is the source of life, and it is precious to Him. And we can name example after example. Cain and Abel, where one brother kills the other because of jealousy. God declares that this is improper. Not just improper, this is absolutely not acceptable. Second, we are to share the same view toward life as God does. It is His sacred gift. And we have no justification for angrily, intentionally, vengefully murdering another individual. We okay there? Let's look then at how David dealt with this. Reading 1 Samuel chapter 26, verses 7 through 11. Now, this was at the time when Saul was king. David had been anointed already by Samuel as the king to be, but Saul was still the king of Israel. And you remember, first Saul called David into his retinue and to play the harp for him and to be in his group. But the more, as time went on, he became more and more jealous of David. Especially when he began hearing the people say, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And that was some of the things that the people of Israel were saying, the crowds were saying, whenever Saul and David and the armies would pass by. And so Saul became very jealous, and in 2 or 3 occasions actually when they were eating together in the large dining hall, he would take his spear and actually threw it at David. I believe it was 3 times that he did. And finally David escaped and left and did not go back to that eating hall. And then you remember the alliance between Jonathan, Saul's son, and David, and so on. Well, Saul then became an active hunter of David, trying to find him and kill him. And David had gathered together an army, if you will, who were following him, 300, 500 men who went with him across wherever he was fleeing to get away from Saul. And then this incident happened. One night, and this is just before these verses take place, David got word that Saul was coming where he was to kill him. And so David and the group hid, and Saul came into their area. And night came, and Saul's camp was there. And so that night, David and Abishai, who was one of David's nephews, came to the troops, that is to Saul's troops, and Saul was lying there asleep in the inner circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground by his head. Abner, who was the commander of Saul's army, and his troops were lying around him. And then Abishai, who was with David, said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy to you. Let me thrust this spear through him into the ground just once. I won't have to strike him twice." But David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. For who can lift a hand against the Lord's anointed and be innocent?" David added, "As the Lord lives, the Lord will certainly strike him down either this day, either his day will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. However, because of the Lord, I will never lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. Instead, take the spear and the water jug by his head, and let's go." So David and Abishai, his nephew. And by the way, David said to his army, "Who will go with me into Saul's camp?" And there were two that volunteered, Ahimelech, something like that, and Abishai. And David chose Abishai to go with him. And so Abishai and David sneak into Saul's camp. Now these camps always had night guards who would stand around and protect, but evidently that night the guards had all gone to sleep too. And whenever they would camp at night, they would camp all the troops and the equipment in the outer circle, and then the commander and the king would sleep in the middle of that, so that they were protected around by all of the troops. But that night, as David gets there, walks into the camp, he finds that the guards are not awake. No one is awake. God has cast them all into a deep sleep. And so as they go there, they find here Saul sleeping, his commander sleeping right next to him, both in deep sleep. The king has put his spear into the ground, spear first, point first, I'm sure, so that he can grab it immediately if he needs it. And his water jug. We all need to have a drink in the middle of the night. And so Abishai says, "Now's your chance, David." Surely he was whispering, huh? "Now's your chance, David." Oh, it doesn't say that. He says, "Let me take his spear and kill him by driving it through him into the ground. I won't need to strike him twice, and he will not make any noise." But David says to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. For who can lift a hand against the Lord's anointed and be innocent?" Now it would seem natural, wouldn't it? Here is his enemy right here. But David's view was, this is the king that God anointed. He is the one chosen by God. And God has not dispensed with him yet. He has said, "David, you will become king," but he didn't say, "David, you are king." He had said, "David, you will become king," and essentially after Saul. But Saul was still the king. And so David refused Abishai's request and said, "No, don't destroy him. As the Lord lives, the Lord will certainly strike him down. Either his day will come," in other words, he'll die a natural death, "or he will die, or he will go into battle and perish." Do you remember how it was that Saul died? How was it? What happened to Saul when he died?
He fell on his sword and he asked his
He
friend
did,
to-
but he fell on his sword because the enemy was circling him and his son Jonathan. And so Jonathan had been killed, actually. And so Saul actually tells one of his workers that was with him, one of the soldiers with him, "Kill me with the sword." And he didn't. He refused to. And Saul fell on his sword and died. Saul had been wounded, by the way, at that time. So David's declaration proves to be true. He will go into battle and perish. However, because of the Lord, I will never lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. Instead, take the spear and the water jug by his head, and let's go. So he refused for Saul to be killed at his own command. Instead, he said, just take his spear and his water jug, and let's go. And so they took the spear and the jug of water, and they quietly left the camp and went back over to their camp. Now David's camp and Saul's camp were divided by a valley. David was on one mountain over here, one hill, and Saul's camp was over on this other hill with a valley in between. And so, as time comes for them to get up, David calls to his king. And Saul awakens or is awake and says, that sounds like David's voice. And so he calls back to David and says, yes, my son, what do you want? David was his son-in-law, by the way. And so David answers and says in verses 22 through 25, here is the king's spear. Have one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord will repay every man for his righteousness and his loyalty. I wasn't willing to lift my hand against the Lord's anointed, even though the Lord handed you over to me today. Just as I considered your life valuable today, so may the Lord consider my life valuable and rescue me from all trouble. And Saul said to him, you are blessed, my son David. You will certainly do great things and will also prevail. And then David went on his way, and Saul returned home. And so here now, across this valley, from hill to hill, David shouting out to Saul, and Saul shouting back to David, they had this conversation. And David says, I have your spear. It doesn't say he had his water jug, but he did. Send one of your young men over to get it. Now, Saul's spear probably was used as also his scepter. You know what a scepter is, right? It was probably a special spear, probably a bit ornate even, but still a deadly spear. And so it stood out from all of the other spears, I would guess, and it's only my theory, from all of the others. He was the king. And so it was clearly Saul's spear, not some other spear that David had. And so Saul sent someone over to get the spear and the jug of water to take it back to his king. But David goes ahead with his speech to Saul, and he says, the Lord will repay every man for his righteousness and his loyalty. I wasn't willing to lift my hand against the Lord's anointed, even though the Lord handed you over to me today. I considered your life valuable, and I ask that the Lord consider my life valuable and rescue me from my troubles. And then Saul blessed him. And at that time, Saul turned his army around, and they went back where they came. And the hunt for David ceased at that time. That wasn't the end of it. It occurred again. David knew he could not trust Saul's words. Whenever he says, you will certainly do great things. Saul didn't promise to quit hunting for David, and David didn't ask him to. David knew that this was an ongoing conflict between the two of them. But he refused to take advantage of the advantage that he had against Saul, because Saul had been anointed by God. So truths from this passage. The Lord will honor the righteousness and faithfulness of his people, even if others do not. And that was the case here. Saul was not honoring It was not keeping righteousness and faithfulness to God. In fact, you remember, it was that he went to the medium, the witch of Endor, to ask, to actually, as he said, pull up Samuel so that he could talk to Samuel. He needed somebody to give him spiritual counsel. So instead of turning to God, he actually went to a witch to ask him to what was going to happen in days to come. In times when we feel threatened, we can trust the Lord to deliver us from tribulation. And we are to bless and not curse our enemies, because we know that the Lord has the last word. So as we study this sixth commandment, no murder, we need to apply it to our own lives. Not that any of us are carrying guns or knives and we're intending on killing another person, murdering another person. But that also in our attitudes, in our speech, in our mix with society, we need to examine ourselves and see, are we treating people fairly? Are we honoring other people as made in God's image? And are we responding to them in the right way? I would say that does not demand that we accept everybody or their opinions or their way of life. To the contrary, the commandments set up a specific way of life for each of us. We're to honor God. We're to worship no other idols. We're to pray to Him and depend on Him and know that He is truly God. That He is the creator of this world. He's the creator of everybody in this world. And we are to treat His creation with respect and honor, but we don't have to agree with it. And so in this day when the issues that you have mentioned, rampant killing, random killing, shootings, violence, trafficking of people, children, of sharing drugs and pushing drugs, of the abortion issue, all of those are spoken to by this commandment. We are to respect God's people. We are to honor God's creation. And know that God will bring judgment on those who do not act faithfully and righteously. But for ourselves, we will keep this commandment. And we will deal with our own anger and our own tendency to hate or despise or reject people who we don't agree with. But at the same time, we will honor God's creation. Any thoughts or questions about that?
Yeah, that's kind of hard. That's kind of hard for me. You know, I pack my gun, and my instructor said, excuse me, my instructor said, there are those that are so evil out there. Many times you're the victim. But if you should shoot someone, he's trying to say get into your home, I have to go out there and drag him inside my home to make sure that I'm covered. Can you see me dragging some man into my home?
I'm not sure that that's the truth. If somebody's trying to break into your home,
Yes.
you have a right to
They have to be inside the house.
Yes, they do.
They have to be, you can't, if they're on the outside of that house, she's exactly right, you better drag them in, because,
Yeah.
they have to be inside your house, or coming inside the house.
Or coming inside the house.
coming in the house, you know, they gotta be, like coming in a window or something like that, and you shoot them.
I mean, in our neighborhood, Daddy lives next to me. I think 3 times now we've been broken into. You know, and I think my house is the last one that they get, because they got into my car and took my gun. My gun was on the seat. When I went out, my car door was open, and my gun was on the seat. Scared me to death, because I forgot to take it in with me. It just frightened me to death. And then they went into Betty's stuff too, all of our homes down the way. That's the 3rd time for us.
Okay. I'm not sure, I did not know this.
Yeah.
It has to be in the house, but that is a legal requirement. That is not this requirement.
So if somebody's coming in your window and you shoot them, you better pull them on in.
Yeah,
That's right.
absolutely.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah. You remember that now.
I will.
Let me just read this. God, through the 6th commandment, said, we must not kill. Jesus said, I would revise that to say, we must not murder. Jesus said we shouldn't even talk in language that belittles another person, makes them feel less than valuable. Look at each and every person as a person of worth in God's sight. And because we are his people, they are valuable in ours as well. Fight for the rights of any who are disenfranchised, abused, threatened, from the womb to the person taking his last breath, from the most elite of society to the most limited. That is what God expects of us. Similar to what David said about Saul, who are we that we would stretch forth our hands to harm one of those whom God loves? And so we're telling goodbye to our people on the web. But I would just ask, what did this lesson mean to you?
David did something generous for Saul.
Okay, repeat that one more time, please.
Okay. Saul opportunity to kill David, but he never did. Why? First, every time David and Saul